So in this video, I was going to call it a method. So in this video, we're going to talk about methods. And a method is essentially just a list of instructions that you give a name to, and the computer refers to that name to carry out that list of instructions. Just like you would bake cookies or a pie or pizza, or you might build a house, in which case you would use a blueprint. Essentially, it's just a collection of instructions that are going to be carried out pertaining to that thing. Now in programming, specifically in Java, they're called methods. Now there's a distinguishing difference between methods and functions, but Java just calls them all methods. So we're going to get into the kind of the basic types, the basic components of a method, and just see what it's all about. Now, it might be confusing, all this, public, void, method, and you might think, well, I got to type this every single time I want to make a method. So what good is that? Well, this sum method, for example, is actually the name of the method. And it could be anything. Literally. It just can't start with a number. In Java, that's generally a no-no. You can have it start with an underscore, and none of the predefined characters. You can have numbers in there, mixed throughout. You can have underscores mixed throughout. You can have capital letters. But generally, it starts with either an underscore or a lower character. Now, here's something we need to pay attention to. When we're naming a method, it should reflect what it's going to be being used for. So, since we're just using generics here, we're just going to be creating just methods. We're just going to give it the name sum method. Because that's what it is. It's just some method. What's it going to do? Well, we don't know yet. Now, this whole first line is referred to as the method header. Everything from the first curly brace to the ending curly brace is referred to as the method body. All the lines of code goes inside there. So then when you want to use the method, you call that method name, and then it'll do whatever code is in there. So let's have it do something interesting. So if we can call this method, the code in here is this print line, and it will print this text to the console. So let's test that and see what it does. We'll leave that up there. Now, you could just paste in the method name, but it's missing some things. It needs the parentheses, and we'll explain later on why it's that, and a semicolon. And that just tells Java that that's the end of it. We can be done. Now, because I'm trying to call this into a main method, we need to include the keyword static, and we'll get into another video of what this word static means. But essentially, it makes it so you don't have to define the object, which won't mean anything to you right now, but later it will make sense. But for now, just know that if you're going to be using this main method, and there's static in the main method, you have to make sure there's static in these other things you're going to be using. It could be a variable, like if we had and we wanted to use that variable in here, we'd need to make sure it said static. Like, just for fun, just to pay attention, just so we're getting rid of that. Keep that in mind. Now, back to this idea of calling a method. Notice we have the method name, we have these parentheses, and a semicolon. Semicolon basically ends that line of code so that Java knows that this is one piece of code, do all that stuff, then go to the next line. The other idea here is when in code, in Java, it works like a stack of stuff. Stack of pancakes, like. The one on the top gets dealt with first. Maybe it's eaten first. And then it goes to the next pancake in line. The next thing on the stack. And if you want to have code operate, if you want to have something happen before something, you just simply put it above it. Simply put it above it. And if you wanted to have it happen afterwards, you put it after that. So let's run this and see what happens. Now we have this, and there's a blank space. Why? Well, first we want to notice that the method worked, because this equals this, at least everything between the quotations. Notice that the user's not seeing all this. This is just code that lets the computer know, lets Java know that we want this little bit of code or this little bit of text to be displayed in the console window. hence the system.out. Now, how did we get these two lines? We got a blank line, we got this. You probably already are seeing this before I am, but I think it's fun to just go over it. We have this method call, and inside that method, we have a print line. So by default, there's going to be a blank space underneath it, because it's the print line. If we got rid of this ln and just did print, notice there's no way to click under there. It's one, that's it. So this other blank line is actually coming from here. If we comment that out and run this, notice there's no more blank line and there's no more blank lines beneath it. Everything's happy, everything's fine. So that's cool. We have a method that can display something. And when I was first learning code and figured out this idea of methods, I stopped at that where I didn't worry about adding arguments. I didn't worry about that stuff. I focused on something that I knew what I knew. I know what this does. I know that if I copy this down and I give it some name and then I refer to that name up here, it's going to do whatever code I have in here. That was all the understanding I needed to be comfortable with methods and play with them. Then I spent time, got very comfortable with that, where I could write methods like it was nothing. Give it any name you want. No problem. And I felt like there was something still missing, and there is. And this gets into understanding kind of the components of this method header. We're not going to get into the word public right now. Just know it represents the code's visibility. All the code that's inside here, or rather this piece of code, is visible to certain other pieces of code. For example, this method up here is visible to this one, and this one is visible to this one because they're both public. But they're also visible because they're within the same class file. This keyword, public, having to do with visibility, is referring to outside of this class file. So code out here this class can access the methods of this class because they're set to public. It's essentially like there's a window into this class that this class is able to peek through and see all the things that are set to public. It's able to see its name. So where do we go from here? We have this method. We're simply able to call it by its name and it'll do some code. That's a powerful idea. We can make as many methods as we want, as many recipes as we want. We can make small ones and large ones, and they'll make the computer do something. That's a pretty cool idea. To me, I feel like that's extremely powerful, and we're beginning to see the tools in programming that we can use. We started with variables, essentially just containers to store stuff, and now we have this idea of methods. So we can use those in conjunction together, but there's a few more things about methods. I feel like to have a good, clear understanding of the basics of methods so that you have enough to kind of go by, there's some other pieces to it that we left out. This word void has to do with the data type of the method. And the data type of the method is just referring to what the method is going to give back. So in this case, we called this method and we ran it. We got this piece of code. So essentially we got that kind of given back. It did something for us. So what if we wanted to take this piece of code here and have it produce the same sort of thing? We'll call it, well, we don't even actually need to give it anything yet. So now we have this method, and if we run it, we don't get anything. Now, something's taken place. It's actually returning a value. It's returning something to the place in code that had called it, but we don't see anything happening. The reason for this is because this is a string. We need to have it displayed in something that displays strings, and system.out.println generally prints out strings, prints out other things, but you're getting a string representation of something. So if we use that method in here, we know that whatever gets returned is going to go into this print line, and then that will get printed to the console. Let's run that, and that's exactly what we see. So now notice that the line of code in here is slightly different. We originally had a print line, and then it had parentheses and all that. And you say, well, it doesn't look much different. Other than that word return, who cares? Well, we're getting into an idea. This idea about methods where they can give us something back. They don't have to just give us just a simple number. In fact, we could have it do more than that. We could have it return my name. But let's say we wanted to have it do calculations. My name plus 10. What would that look like? It's going to be my name with the number 10 tossed on the end of it. Not really doing any calculations, but it's returning something extra. So how could we get it where it would return a calculation, for example? Well, let's change it from string to int. And let's have it do some stuff. We'll put in my age and how old I'm going to be in 10 years. And we run this. Oh, apparently I'll be 44 in 10 years, which is true. I don't know if I said 4 years, but it's in 10 years. I'll be 44 in 10 years. So that's cool. It can return a calculation. That's neat. We can return calculations. We can return strings of text. We can call it, and it'll give us something back. What if we want to give the method something and have it give us something back? Or maybe we just want to give it something and have it do something. Let's look at those two ideas. So in this case, we're going to have it give us we're going to give it an age. We're going to give it 2 ages, and we're going to have it add them together. And then we're going to have it return them. So it's going to return this age plus this age. So it's going to be one total that it's going to return. And what 2 ages should we give it? Well, we'll give it mine. And since, well, we can't use a plus, the comma is the first argument in the method we're giving it. Now, you might think, well, you're going all over the place and I'm not really following. We're going to explain it. Don't worry. Don't get all high and mighty. What this does is it's going to take 2 ages and adds them together. And maybe we'll give it a better name. Maybe that's more descriptive. Add 2 ages together. And let's just pick maybe a 30-year-old. So me and then let's say Bob, and Bob is 30 years old. What's our combined age? We run that. Our combined age is 64. So we have this ability to give methods something and to get something back from methods. If we don't want anything back from them, we just make them void. Let's say we wanted to give this, but we don't want it to get anything back. Well, we can have it do calculations, but where do those calculations go? That's one question. That's one idea. We could use a system.out.println where it would print out, it would do the calculations. It's giving us that issue because of that. Still gives us the same values. We input 2 values and we get some total back. This printout is actually printing it to the screen. If you were going to have a method where you took 2 of these ideas and you returned them back, I would just simply make the data type of the calculation. you're trying to make. So let's look at this top line here and figure out what all of these things mean. There's a lot of words, there's a lot of things. Public has to do with the scope or the visibility that this method has to code outside of this class. So this method is visible. It would be visible to this class if it had an object in here referring to that class. The static, which we're not going to get into too much right now, but essentially makes the thing that it's connected to so that the class that it's in doesn't have to be defined first. So because this is static, in here we could say test, because that's the name of the class at top, dot, that method. Why is it giving us an error? Why? Two age together. Identifier expected after token. Well, first off, it's trying to use a print line outside of a method. Secondly, it's missing its arguments, and that's it. So because it's static, because this method is static, we don't have to define an object of this. If it wasn't static, let's say we stop accessing it there. If it wasn't static, we would have to take this test class now we have an object of that class. Using the dot operator, we could access its method. So if you notice, we have now two lines of code, whereas before, by making static, we can simply just use this class file, and we eliminate one of the lines of code. There's a bunch of other reasons why it's good, but essentially it does cut down on code. But this isn't about classes. This isn't about class files. It's about methods. So, you have an idea of public, you have an idea of static. Void has to do with the return type. And all it just means is the data that you're getting back from the method after it finishes has to be of that type. It has to be that type of data you're getting back, whether it's an integer, a double, a string, a boolean, whatever. So you have a lot of flexibility, a lot of power in this idea. When I say power, I'm referring to the creativity that you get from programming. You have this collection of tools that you can then take a problem in the real world and build software around to solve a problem. That's powerful. This expands the powerfulness of it. You have it like a diversity here. You're not just limited to one data type. You can bring back all kinds of types. Now, the name, generally generic, but should be reflecting the thing it's being used for. It should be worded almost like a simple little phrase that's saying what it's going to do. This adds two, we could even put adds, two ages together. Pretty simple, and that's exactly what it does. Now, when we call a method, not sure why we're having issues. Okay, when we call a method, remember, if there was nothing there, we had just the parentheses. The reason for this is to allow for the arguments. And now this brings us to the point that we're at here. They're known as parameters or arguments. Generally, it's a value you're going to give a method. And it's a way that you can give it something. So these parentheses are a way kind of to reserve space for the arguments you want to give it. So in this case, we gave it two integer arguments, the first age and the second age. Now, when we're defining these, you have to specify the data type, and then you give a name. This represents a variable. It's going to be when the user passes in something or gives us an argument, it has to put it somewhere. And this is so that in your code inside of the method, this method knows how to refer to that value that was given by the user. And this name can be any name you want. In fact, if we have we can actually give it that exact same name, but it's not the same name. It's not referring to the same thing. Its visibility or its scope is only relevant inside the method. It can get confusing if you give it the same name as something outside of it. I generally avoid it. I just give it a very descriptive name for what's going on. Maybe it's passed in age 1. Because that's what's going to happen. We're passing in somebody's age. Passed in, I don't know why I put int. Passed in age 1. And maybe we want to do it over here and passed in age 2. They're descriptive to what's happening. And now here, well, add that to that. Add the first passed in age to the second passed in age. And then print it out. I generally, if I know that it's going to, if you know your data type that you're getting back, in this case it's going to be integer, we'll just return this calculation here. No need for a print line. Makes it cleaner looking. This method, like if we collapse it up, we know that it's just going to give us back an integer value. If the code in there works, it's just going to give us some number. And if we run that, we know that because we're giving some number, we need to put that some number somewhere, or that number somewhere. And this brings another interesting idea. So let's say that we want to take, and we'll give it 0 for now. We won't even assign it. And let's say we want to take this. We want to give this value, and we want to have it printed out, the value inside here. It's given an error because it hasn't been instantiated. We'll just equal 0. So 0 is in there. But let's say we wanted to get the calculated ages. We use this method name, since we have the variable here, equals this method, and now we need to give it those values, my age plus Bob's age. Bob I think was 30. And then we run this, and it gives that new combined total. Essentially what's taking place is we have our variable, which is set to 0. We then say, take that variable, use the method, this method, which is going to calculate and return a value, store it inside of this variable, and then on this print line, we just basically say, display the contents of this variable. And we run that, and that's what's taking place. So those are essentially the parts of a method. Kind of to see them here all laid out. We have a standard method. It doesn't really do anything. It just, well, it does something, but whatever code is in there is all it does. We have another one that returns a value. We'll call this 2. We'll call this one 2. And then we have one that has arguments. It returns a value based on its data type. Really, we could say that there's just 2. When you change the data type, you're specifying that it has to return a value. It doesn't actually need arguments at that point. It can just return. And maybe it does calculations in there. And then it just returns. Notice it's very similar on the method header to this one. In fact, it's identical other than it has that added to it. The only difference is the data type that it's returning, or it's known as its return type. I keep calling it data type because it is a type of data, but it's also known as the return type. The return type of the method, which is the data type that it's returning. And then you have this last additional idea, which is arguments, where you can give the method something to do. Maybe it's not so much just ages. Maybe it's colors. Maybe it's true-false values. Maybe it's another class altogether. Maybe it's an array. That's left to the programmer. But this is kind of the breakdown, not kind of, this is the breakdown to methods. Get comfortable with these ideas. Get comfortable with a standard, just a public void method that doesn't return anything, doesn't have any arguments, just a simple little recipe, like a baking of cookies. Which, let's take that. The baking of cookies is going to return cookies in the end. Its final result will be cookies. So it's technically returning something. Could make the argument that it's building something, which is probably more true than actually returning something. Maybe if you went to the bank and you were depositing money in your account, you would get a receipt. If there was a method that handled all that, the return type would be of type probably string, because it's returning a printed receipt. This brings an interesting idea up in programming, which is you want to take these concepts that you're learning about and relate them to the real world. If you can relate them to many objects in the real world, and it should be something that you're familiar with, you're comfortable with, you're creating a connection in your brain to this abstract idea in programming, in this language of Java, to the real world. You need to have as many of these connections as you can, because it makes it simple. The simpler something is, the easier it is to remember, and then the easier it is to work with. So methods have these three basic structures to them. Standard method doesn't really return anything, doesn't have any arguments, really simple and easy. That's actually what I stayed with for a long time. When I say long time, 3-4 years. I did not bother with this other stuff. Didn't need to. Didn't need to worry about passing stuff in. But if you can get comfortable with this return type, understanding that relationship to a method, and then the arguments and the purpose of them. The purpose of the arguments is when you want to give a method something that, like, maybe it's going to work some calculations. Maybe it's going to build something or create something. Where it needs additional information. When you're needing to give it additional information, that's when you add arguments to it. And other than that, there's not much else to be said. You have, in my opinion, everything you need to know about methods to just go and kind of not do some damage, but have fun, create some stuff. Make up a project and start using what you've learned. The best way to get good at something is to spend time with it. The more time you spend, the better you become, the more familiar and more comfortable you are with it. It's the same for every concept in programming. There's a simple, like 6 or 7 point step questionnaire, so to speak, or phases that you'll go through when it comes to programming, and I'll have a video on that. And it's the same process you're going to use for every concept you cover in the language.